young entrepreneur in his early 40s, passed away, heart disease. He is, of course, one of those very active ones on the scene, on the rise,
and he
and yet
also
life lost.
has a background of journalism, and he's not really from the medical background, but he's a very well-known, and his enterprise, his new startup firm, is just about to get IPO listed. Yeah,
so what do you make of it from your perspective as an entrepreneur yourself?
Well, it's sad that it's a lesson for every entrepreneur to learn from, not only about ourselves, but about our employees. Although I always stress, the importance of discipline. I always expect my own employees to come to work 10 to 15 minutes ahead of time, like the Japanese do. But health issue is really something serious.
When you talk about entrepreneurs in China, of course, that's a upswing trend in this economy, very active factor. They are under the spotlight. They are at conferences, on the stage, talking to people, being inspirational, while at the same time, back in the company, they are the leading sheep, shall we say, leading the whole staff forward. And they are expecting themselves to work longer hours, so do their employees. What do you make of it? Is this the very special development stage, or is this just very special a social group that we're talking about here, Mr. Dong?
Well, if you look at the overall picture, China has been the engine of global economic development. It must be running faster than the average. And also the Chinese people are like those crazily running horses to drag the chariots to run faster and faster for several decades already. And now, although the current leadership of China has realized the importance of restructuring the development mode and also for better environment and better health, better healthy lifestyle, but it takes some time. Even this restructuring process may make the distribution of labor force even uneven, and some people get even busier, but other people are kind of laid back.
Mr. Ding, can we really keep that balance given your knowledge of the experiences, let's just say in the United States or elsewhere in Japan, for example, as an economy on the upswing, maintain this speed of development while at the same time individual health? Is it possible?
Absolutely. And I think many companies are very short-sighted when they only think of workers and working more hours, because there's three factors. There's the personal health of your workers in terms of getting obesity, diabetes, cancer, stroke. It's also the safety, because a worker who works long hours and has little sleep is the equivalent of drinking alcohol on the job in terms of mental capacity, memory function. And this gets to the third factor, is the productivity, which you have to realize is productivity goes down exponentially with increasing worker hours. And so I think getting that right balance is really essential. Like take for example, if in the world of entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley, say Apple or Facebook or even a small startup, the actual number one thing they value is worker happiness and productivity, and that's why all these big tech companies give so much amenities, even startups. And so I think that working smarter and working more productive is the key thing in this transition, because Chinese workers will work very hard, but in terms of productivity per worker economically, Korean Japanese workers are much, much higher, 2 or 3 folds higher in terms of productivity per hour worker.
I see.
And during that transition, we have to work on that aspect.
Right. Mr. Dong, do you take that, is this an issue of a different development stage, or is this the issue of realizing what is more important? Can people really control their working hours at this moment?
Well, I think it's, in most cases, I think it's motivation by the employer for the employees to work longer hours.
And also peer pressure as well.
Yes. Also, I think it's relatively easy to understand what Mr. Ding just pointed out. The key word is smart. You need to work smarter. But when it comes to China, the entrepreneurs or the bosses would say, okay, we have a different culture. Our people are not always active. They are so passive. If you don't push them hard enough, they will just, steal your hours.
You do sound like an entrepreneur, shall I just say that?
Exactly, and the culture thing can come as an excuse, a big excuse. Yes.
Well, for Mr. Zhang, the one who passed away, and certainly we would like to convey our condolences to his family, but his company has been doing what they call 996, which is 9 o'clock in the morning, you get to the office, 9 o'clock, only after that, p.m., you leave the office. That's only allowed, and also 6 days work, to say the least.
Exactly,
but,
yes.
Mr. Dong, of course, these are clear, slogans of the company, but there are many other hidden practices, not just in China, in the Silicon Valley as well. Just as Mr. Ding mentioned about the beautiful stories from Silicon Valley, people are working overtime. They work at home, for example, with a 24 hours of globalization kinds of business. How can you escape that? So the question is, can we really be able to avoid this, the overwork, all kinds of overwork, Mr. Ding?
Yeah, I have the same problem. Some of my colleagues take a digital Sabbath, as they say, 1 day a week, and everyone understands it and has this expectation that they do not reply on the Saturday, for example. But I think long term, there is, I'm an entrepreneur as well, and there is an expectation that you have to get over these work humps. But at the same time, we really have to focus on the productivity, because productivity and the team morale, if you're focusing on it as China's developing into a white collar, more service-based, intellectual-based economy, these things are much more important. These are not just fitting more widgets on an assembly line. That's not how the Chinese economy is moving. It's becoming an intellectual economy. And into an intellectual economy, you have to transition. And in France, there's a motto. There's people live to work, and some people work to live. And I think we need to get away from working just so you can live. Get to working so you can live, as opposed to living so you can work.
Well, of course, those are beautiful lifestyles, and also it is not just in the Chinese culture or during the current economic development stage of China, but also we've seen very similar phenomena inside Japan. For example, the well-known word karoti actually started from Japan, another Asian country. Even when you talk about those issues in China, as some of the white-collar workers, this is what we have found out. A recent poll shows a majority of those surveyed claim to have no other choice but to work hard or even overtime. Only 30% of Chinese white-collar workers value health over their career, and 17% say they will sacrifice health to make as much money as possible. Of course, those are not necessarily the things we want to encourage with this program. When ill, only around 10% say they will go to hospital, and over 50% say they will just live with it. Startlingly enough, 20% of the medical expenses are on minor illnesses. The rest is spent a month before death. Oh my God, look at that number. That's really threatening. We are not doing this program to threaten anybody who work very hard, but rather to talk about the kind of lifestyle we should have and the right work and life balance, and what our life should be really about. What does professional success mean for our lives? I'm sure those deep questions, Mr. Dong, at every step of your career choices, you have to, as an entrepreneur, think about that. Share with some of those with us.
Well, I might think differently from those entrepreneurs, like Mr. Zhang, who just passed away. We can understand that almost all of those IT startups based on the internet, they shoulder the pressure. They have the pressure from the investors, because the investors would expect short-term returns to exceed the average growth rate.
So are you blaming the investors? Are you blaming the investors, even though they're looking at them as the angels?
Well, you can blame the overall model of development of China now. Although, as I said earlier, that Mr. President Xi Jinping has stressed the importance of restructuring and changing the model, but it takes some time. We are just in that process. But in this process, when we encourage, innovation and entrepreneurial startups, and it may cause even more such tragedies of workaholics.
Well, I think it has a lot to do with awareness that people have about work and life balance. Mr. Ding, you yourself also said as an entrepreneur, I mean, you must have the highest level of awareness about this as a medical major. And yet, when it comes to hard choices, how are you making those choices? Can you really follow your conscience, or you have to follow your most depressing job of the hour?
Right. I think once upon a time in my earlier youth, I made those mistakes of sacrificing my health too much in favor of certain pursuits. And I think now that, for example, I have a son, those really, having a child really reorientates your life, that, life is not just about more money and more work, but also spending time so that you can actually enjoy your life outside of it. But during that transition, it was very, very difficult. And I think as young people progress, this is a challenge that we don't have an answer for. But in terms of the costs that you mentioned, 50% of most countries' costs do go to end-of-life care. But I think what people need to focus more on is the prevention aspect. And I'm certainly guilty myself, but this is a struggle, whether it's work-life balance, child, work-family balance,
yes, indeed.
Personal health versus public health, your job. I think this is a challenge that all countries will have to struggle with. I think especially as China progresses.
It is a personal challenge. It's also a social and economic challenge. Has other economies graduated from this stage? Mr. Dong, very briefly from you, for example, if you look at your Japanese counterparts, your American counterparts?
Well, I think the Japanese, their economy slowed down several decades ago, but they still have that kind of culture to, of diligent working, and their work ethics can be a model for the world, although Westerners do not really admire that. But many Chinese would really take that as, as an example for them to learn from. And also, we don't deny that there are, because China is such a huge country, there are millions of Chinese who do enjoy their life somewhere in their own corners around China. But we're talking about the urban workforces in Beijing, Shanghai, and all the other major metropolitan cities. And they face the pressure. They keep to compete against one another. Right. They keep making promises that they cannot meet within 8 hours every day.